Button. And are we live? I have hit the live button. I, of course, have to double check now. I am not seeing this live.
I'm seeing live on my screen here.
Are you? I'm not seeing live on mine. Maybe I'm a little late since we have this storm here in Chicago. All right. Well, then welcome everybody to Aeon Byte Live. Glad to see everybody is here. I'm still not seeing this live. There you go. People are starting to come in, and this is great. Of course, I have about a million things I need to adjust to make everybody happy. That's adjusted. This adjusted. So you can see us, Chris?
I can see you.
You can see me?
Yeah, who else am I supposed to be seeing?
Oh, I thought you were on the YouTube.
No, I'm on Zoom.
All right, let me see. So I see people in the chat. Can anybody see us?
Let me go into the
Yes, we're
YouTube
live.
page. We're live?
Yes, we're live. Awesome.
Yeah,
Awesome.
professional operation here.
That's what happens when you leave it to the two of us to figure this techno stuff. Well, awesome. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us on AB Live 26. We were having a few technical difficulties. Robert Price and his wife were supposed to join us, but they are struggling with those archons of technology. But the show must go on. In fact, as the lyrics say, my ship isn't coming and I just can't pretend. So, and that is, of course, from the great Neil Peart. We will be discussing today on this sort of special show, more or less impromptu, that I really wanted to get off the ground for reasons I will tell you. But of course, with us, always glad to have Chris Knowles. How you doing, Chris?
I'm doing great. Doing good. Glad to be here.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, again, we hope that Robert Price and his lovely wife, Carol, can join us once they fix their tech issues. If not, in the meantime, Chris and I will discuss somebody we really mutually liked, and I'll speak more. For me, Rush obviously wasn't just a band. Rush was a coping skill when I was in high school and through college. Really moved me. And Neil Peart's death, of course, really affected me very much. So, but what about you, Chris? How did you encounter Rush, and how did you feel after his death and so forth? Who was Rush to you?
Oh, I was a way early Rush adopter, like 76, like when 2112 came out, for real. I guess I was still 9, almost 10. But my mother had these, my mother was a professional musician, and we had this sort of, I guess, like this extended clan, I guess, but we were always like at, somebody's house who was in the troupe. And one of the people in the troupe lived in Marshfield, Massachusetts, and they lived like right on the marsh. It's this beautiful house, this huge house, modern. They had like this jacuzzi in the bedroom and the floor and everything. It was just an amazing house. But so we were over there a lot. And the guy who owned the house, his son was there. He usually lived with his mother, but this guy had a stereo like you wouldn't believe. I mean, and like his living room had like 12-foot ceilings, and it was just amazing. So he put on 2112, and I was just like, what the hell is this? It just blew me away. I mean, because I was listening to Aerosmith and Queen and Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin and all that kind of stuff. And I heard that Rush album, and I was just like, I couldn't believe it. It started off with the 2112 overture, and then Temples of Syrinx, and it was played at like ear-splitting volume on this like $10,000 stereo, and it was just an incredible experience. So I had gotten 2112, and soon after that, I got All the World's a Stage, and I sort of caught up with a lot of the older material, the double LP set, and then it was just off from there. And I think really like. So that was 76. I was 10. I was very young. And then in high school, I sort of rediscovered them because I kind of had this like, punk rock, new wave, alt rock period. And then I rediscovered them, I guess when Signals came out, because Signals, it's interesting, there was a new wave station in Boston called WLYN. It eventually became WFNX, but they would play Rush. I mean, they played a lot of stuff off Signals. They played Subdivisions and New World Man. And, I sort of got back in touch. I mean, I'd never really dropped out with them because, they were everywhere. Even though, I mean, it's interesting that they really didn't catch on here or around where I was until Permanent Waves came out with Spirit of Radio. And I think that was really sort of their breakthrough. I think they were still very much bubbling under the surface. And there was a band that I think Gen X sort of took to heart because they'd been around since the early 70s. And I don't think like that boomer, late boomer cohort really embraced them too much. And it wasn't until they really started getting into the technology and the electronics, towards albums like Permanent Waves and Moving Pictures and of course Signals, that I think they really were sort of taken to the bosom of our generation. And, they really became sort of a touchstone for a certain kind of boy because they were definitely a boys band. You didn't really see a lot of girls listening to Rush, at least not in my experience. But, boys who were very serious and probably wrote like, some poetry. Nobody was looking, but we're really into electronics and
That's very true.
And maybe shop class. It was very much an interesting sort of phenomenon that there was a certain cohort that appealed to them that I think was a cohort that had been resistant to prog, as it was understood. But you also, that was a period, like particularly up in Signals and Grace Under Pressure, where a lot of these sort of 70s prog bands were sort of reinventing themselves. Genesis had really reinvented themselves with Duke and Abacab, and of course the self-titled album. And then they sort of, they got a little weird. But, Yes had the Owner of a Lonely Heart and, all those kind of singles. And, it was like a rediscovery for a lot of this prog stuff. King Crimson, Discipline, Beat, Three of a Perfect Pair. I mean, there was a really interesting period where a lot of, sort of these hairy, hoary prog bands discovered new music. They discovered the new wave, post-punk, and they also discovered all the electronics and the keyboards and the synthesizers and stuff. And it really, it created like this really interesting and vibrant music that was not, it was almost like beyond category. And I think Rush really fit very comfortably into that because, like I said, I mean, they'd get played on the new wave station in Boston at the time. And this is the time when Peter Gabriel was doing stuff like Shock the Monkey, the album Security. And it was Kate Bush came out with The Dreaming. So it was a really interesting period where a lot of like 70s acts were discovering the newer music that was going on and really creating like this almost like this third option for music that wasn't tied down to any particular genre. Oh, we have company.
We have been joined. Bob and Carol, can you hear us?
We can hear you. Can you hear us?
Yes, sound good.
Oh,
Welcome
hey,
aboard. We started the Rush train
Thank you.
as
Yeah.
again repeating Rush, as Neil Peart said, my ship isn't coming and I just can't pretend. So we started the show, but we are glad you're on, Bob and Carol. There's Chris, and here is and you are live on YouTube. Say hello to everybody.
Hello, Bob.
Hey, Chris.
Hello, Carol.
Hey, how
Hi.
you doing?
Always good to talk Rush with people.
Yes,
Mm.
indeed. So
Always.
yes, so I just briefly asked Chris about Rush.
And by the way,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, with Carol's name, you pronounce it with a Q.
With a Q.
Anyway,
okay.
Carol's really the big Rushnik here. I mean, she and I wrote the book together, but she's the one with the most interesting history of involvement with Rush.
So says.
Wow,
Yeah.
and Chris just mentioned that chicks didn't listen to Rush. We have one. We found the one, Chris. So good
Yep.
deal. So Carol,
Yeah.
tell us who Rush meant to you, and what did you feel about the loss of Neil Peart?
Ah. Well, I got on the Rush train. It was 1974. I was living in Cleveland, listening to WMMS, and actually, I was just moving from Cleveland then, but I had been there long enough to know who they were, and I was smitten right away. Actually, but my first album wasn't until 2112,
Hmm.
and that 76 was my real beginning, I guess. And the lyrics struck me, as well as the music. I mean, what a package. The lyrics. It really is responsible for my getting into and studying philosophy in college. They had me thinking along lines I wasn't used to thinking of, and it was very satisfying. And I didn't know anyone around me that thought like that. I didn't have that kind of exposure in, high school. So they just opened up a whole world for me. And uh, so, I mean, Neil's lyrics really kind of had a lot to do with developing who I am today. And the blow, I was really surprised at how it struck me. I mean, I'm still still in the throes of it, really.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I'm going to share for the audience out there in the chat room as you're joining in. If you have any questions, please write them in all caps or questions, and I will ask and tell me who's the question is for, and I will get it to our audience. We can talk about Rush, of course, if you want to expand it to whatever the topics around Neil, like progressive rock or Ayn Rand or Tolkien or the whole satellite, intellectual satellite and metaphysical energies around Rush, feel free to do so. And I also wanted to share, yeah, I mean, why I felt I needed to do this show. Last Friday was one of those classic bad things come in threes. I had just found out that a good friend of mine is being deported back to Mexico, to Guadalajara. So I arrived home and I was bummed out. As soon as I got home, I got a text from my son that an elderly family member had passed away. And I got home, I got the text. As soon as I step out to have a cigarette and call my son to see what was going on, I get one of those Chicago Tribune alerts, Neil Peart, drummer of Rush, passed away. So it was like getting hit all at once. And I spent the
Triple
entire
whammy.
weekend, of course, dealing with the family member who had passed away and talking to my friend who was being deported. And around Sunday, I was doing errands and I just started blasting, 2112, all the other Rush, and I got emotional. And then I said, well, let's do a show. So, but I'm glad we're here because I really think he is one of the giants of rock. I know some people have said that Rush is like the ultimate cult band, but I'd like to say there's more to it. So I guess I'd like to ask Carol and Bob, what would you say? You wrote a book called The Theology of Rush. What is the theology of Rush?
The book is called Mystic Rhythms, The Philosophical Vision of Rush. And there it is, the modest little book. Well, it discussed different philosophical topics, but really a lot of what we talked about is really what they talked about: character. And that's something, of course, religion theology deals with. Um, and somehow there's an overlap into spiritual things. I mean, certainly Neil himself is a great exemplar of someone who has really embodied his principles and pushed himself to the limit. I mean, all the members really. I mean, that's why they're who they are. I guess they were determined, they were courageous, and they lived up to their principles, which were, well, a number of things I lather on. But
I think, I think we're losing you. Are you seeing them being lost there, Chris?
Yeah, they just froze and the audio just kind of went out.
Yeah. Well, hopefully they'll jump back. And what about you, Chris? What would you say can we say there's any sort of metaphysical or philosophical centrality to Neil Peart's lyrics beyond this sort of, I don't want to be reductionistic, this sort of mixture of Ayn Rand and Tolkien?
Well, I'm kind of a person who thinks lyrics are really kind of overrated in music. Brian, said, he was always wondering why does everybody worry about what the music or the lyrics mean? What about this guitar part or this drum part? That has meaning too.
Mm-hmm.
And, the thing that really struck me about Rush is that they really created like this imaginary space, this like liminal space through sound that, to me was much more influential and effective than the lyrics, which, I appreciated, but I never really, I guess I didn't really take to heart because, I was living inside the world of sound. And, we had discussed how, the live sound and I think, a lot of the albums, a lot of the recording on the albums would get a little fussy, get a little too, a little bit too long in the oven, that it just sort of took a lot of the life, which is why I really appreciated the live material, because it just opened up. And that, a song like La Villa Strangiato or Brune's Bane, or, all these songs, these sort of epic songs that created like this sense, this inner world, this imaginary world that you could place yourself into. And one of the things I think that's really undervalued is just, how their sound influenced not only prog bands and metal bands and hard rock bands, but really had a huge influence on post-punk and really had an influence on alt rock and stuff. Just the way that they created sound was so unique in so many different ways and did not rely on idiom. They were creating their own idiom. Certainly the early stuff is, it's obviously very hard rock. It's influenced by groups like Budgie and Led Zeppelin. But, when they really developed their own style, they just created this interesting vocabulary of sound. And even bands like Van Halen, I think were very influenced by Rush, and particularly, I think Alex Van Halen, he might not cop to it. I don't know if he does or not, but I'm sure he was very influenced by Neil Peart. A very different way of playing, a different way of making sound that wasn't reliant on these just worn out, tired old idioms that, certainly by 1980, I was completely sick of, I wanted to hear new sounds, I wanted to hear something different. And I think, the way that they really embraced that, even starting earlier than Permanent Waves, I would even argue that 2112, it's a very interesting sonic album, the way they used flange and phase and all these different kind of guitar effects, and the way Neil was playing, which was, it wasn't reliant on, John Bonham and Keith Moon. It was his own vocabulary. And I think what really influenced that is that, I knew he grew up on a farm, and he probably spent a lot of time by himself, and he's probably spent a lot of time outdoors, and you can kind of feel that sort of inner space translated into the music.
Yeah, in fact, for the audience, this show will be complete obviously for YouTube, but also when I put it on iTunes and iHeartRadio and all these places, since it's again a special show. But I will also add Chris's our old interview on the secret history of rock and roll. Great book, because I feel it will really add to the whole idea. Our rock gods are kind of like the old gods. There are these incorporeal beings, or they come with us in non-matter forms, and they wake us up. They tell us we can be better than we are, that we belong, and they expect to commune with us and offer a sacrifice. We don't have these type of rock gods. But hey, Chris, and from your book, I was looking at it. Obviously, you couldn't put all the bands you wanted to, or you'd have like 6 volumes. But I thought, would Rush fall under Hermetic?
Yeah, didn't I include them?
I don't see.
It's true what I
No.
did. They might have been in the first edit. That book was brutal because I was so limited as far as my word count, and it was like writing a book with like boxing gloves on. It was really brutal. I'm pretty sure I covered them in an earlier draft of the book, and I maybe had to cut it because I had to cut a lot of groups. I had cut a lot of groups that I really like, and it was really painful.
So we would put them under Hermetic. That's what I figured.
Absolutely. Yeah,
I agree. Bob and Carol, can you hear us?
We can hear you.
Awesome. Great to hear.
Yes.
Great to hear. So back to Rush, what would you say are some of the, as I asked Chris, could we, and I was being reductionistic because as the host, I'm supposed to just put out these little morsels, but can we say Neil Peart's theology is a simple mixture of Ayn Rand and Tolkien, or is it more complex than that?
Well, it seems to me that his approach to awareness, etc., is reminiscent, strangely enough. I know this is going to sound like I'm just using my old stock and trade and it's all warped by my interests, but it does genuinely seem to me that his apprehension of things is much like that of H.P. Lovecraft, though you wouldn't necessarily know it outside of his sonnet cycle, The Fungi from Yuggoth. There are 5 sonnets they're like over 30 altogether, but there are 5 which sort of get out of the usual horror element and talk about the sensing of an unknown infinite beyond the mundane world, which, however, the perception of it is triggered by certain things in this world, like the slanting sunset rays on old barns or on the cityscape of Providence and things like this. When evening has come, the lights of the city and all that. He says these things somehow releases from the bonds of the mundane world of the senses. And though he was not a theist and wouldn't have considered himself religious, but I think that's pretty well true of Neil as well. It's pretty clear he wouldn't have thought he was a member of a religion. He wasn't a theist. He thought of God as a kind of imaginary friend, which I think is correct in that regard. But he's also very much like the father of liberal theology, Friedrich Schleiermacher, writing in the mid-19th century, who was reconceiving what religion really was, because he knew he was a great New Testament scholar and a translator of Plato, and he was incredibly erudite, and he knew that you couldn't just take the Bible as a revelation of invisible truths. That no, it's too culturally and historically conditioned, it's too mythical, but it does trigger in us a new sense of what he called piety, and by that he meant, well, he used to call it God consciousness, but it was more to the point when he called it a sense and taste for the infinite, which goes beyond individual personhood and so on. And he went on to sort of make connections between that and traditional Christian symbolism and the like, but like the later Paul Tillich, who did the same sort of thing, but said ultimately the only non-symbolic thing we can say about God is that God is being itself. And when people have encounters with God or with the holy, what they're doing is seeing. It's almost Buddhist or Zen. The veil of the mundane is ripped away, and you encounter the ground of your being, which I know sounds pretty abstract, but again, that reminds me pretty heavily of what Neil says about the way he perceives and receives his surroundings when he's out on the motorcycle and so forth, and when he looks in the faces of his audience and so on. He's seeing a higher or deeper dimension of it. That is a kind of spirituality, though not necessarily religiosity.
Well, from the song Mystic Rhythms, he would say, we sometimes catch a window, a glimpse of what's beyond. Was it just imagination stringing us along? You know, it's just this glimpse. I can see that he's had that glimpse. He's touch transcendent. And again, I think he embodies it in a lot of ways. He's just lives so well.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
Yeah,
indeed.
I think of Aristotle, who says that God, quote unquote, is the unmoved mover, a personification of perfection, which by its cause all things, all creatures toward it, which means they fulfill their potential as much as they can, and they will be as perfect as they can be. And that means following through on their inborn aim, or the entelechy, he called it, like an acorn, unless it's planted, unless the tree is cut down, it will and must develop into a mighty oak. Well, human beings have certain inborn possibilities, potential, and so wasted no time fulfilling every bit of potential he had. He was a fanatical reader of all kinds of material, and you can see, like you mentioned, Rand and Tolkien, and then there's Nietzsche and various others that he assimilated not uncritically. And he mentions how novels are so great because it's sort of a vicarious way of multiplying your own experiences beyond those which you had, so you can learn from others. And that's really the whole point of wisdom. And he started going to art museums, though he had no training or education in that, but he just felt like he could expand the range of his self, and became very educated. And the result was not some pompous windbag like me, but rather somebody who really followed up on all these resources of potential and development. And you can see that in his character, as Carol said. He's, any interview you see with the guy, from what he describes about his reactions to other people, his views of life, and so on, here is someone who became what he had the potential to be. And it's no wonder that comes through in his songs, that you could do it too, even when he doesn't explicitly say that.
Well said indeed. And there's a question for you, Bob or Carol. Would you agree that he embraced technology musically while his lyrics paradoxically warned of being enslaved by it?
Did he embrace it? I think for a while he did. I'm not certain of how comfortable he was with it, but he's certainly proficient. When, you know, in the 80s, kind of ignorance of the terms, you know, the tech, you know, what the pieces are called and everything, but he was using it, and I don't think he had a problem with it in principle.
Remember, he says, fools try to wish it away. That's never going to work. Of the launching of the rocket, in very similar terms to the dropping of the A-bomb on Japan. And both he sees as sort of glorious Promethean achievements. And even though the danger is obvious, and in other songs, he says, yeah, he laments the fact that this can easily turn us into a bunch of robots with plastic covered fists. And the mind is the mother of all machines, yet it can be captivated by it. So he seemed to me to have a pretty good
balance.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like Bob mentioned with Countdown, you know, the rockets launching, you know, I mean, he talks about, you know, just the awe of that moment and the tremendous power involved. And the music plays right along with it and really depicts a sense of glory and triumphant you know, it's a masterpiece for what it's trying to do, and you know, just an example of how they just communicate and convey and render, you know, different ideas and feelings, you know, through the music and their words.
Wonderful. Yes. And of course, I love the whole sci-fi sensibility. It's one of my
Yeah.
weaknesses is rock and sci-fi. I'm probably one of those few people who loves Uriah Heep. And of course, Floyd's
Oh, I
just,
saw them in concert. They were
oh,
fantastic. I
so
love them.
jealous. Yes, I'm a sucker
Ah,
for fantasy rock and all that. Just
Oh yeah, that was in Cleveland, by the way. A World Fantasy, or no, not Fantasy World Series of Rock. That was
in
wow.
fact, Carol has seen about any group you can name.
That's not
Seriously.
Wow.
true. That's not true.
Almost. And of course, Miguel,
Yeah, that's
I just wrote a story that is pretty obviously from the title, a kind of combination of religion and old time space opera. It's based on the old Planet Stories hero, Star Pirate. And the title of the story is Terrors of the Buddha Field. And I was tempted to call because this is one of those things where they picture all of the planets inhabited by intelligent life. And I was thinking the other day, it hasn't been published yet, but as a tribute to Neil. I don't know.
Oh, wonderful. That's awesome. Sounds like a plan. Can't wait. Great. And moving to
sense
Chris.
of possibility.
Yeah, no kidding. Moving to Chris, this is an interesting part. I know you've been blogging about the whole woke culture. And of course, I've enjoyed each one of them because again, you're so insightful and right. But I recall I was doing some research when Rush came out with 2112. There was sort of this proto wokeness already in the air because people were calling Rush right wingers, and some English writer had to throw out the Nazi card towards Rush in 1976. Of course, Geddy Lee was completely hurt because his parents are Holocaust survivors.
Yes.
Workaholics. So, what do you think of that, Chris? Was that sort of incubating back then?
Yeah, the British press was a disaster.
Is
Was, I mean, it was really toxic back then, though. And, you know, this very strange mentality crept in where, I mean, it was very similar to what you're seeing on college campuses today. Probably wasn't as totalitarian as it's become, but there was a very strange idea about enforcing, you know, totalitarian, authoritarian ideals and imposing them on music. And they ended up, you know, supporting a very small group of artists and shunning most of the mainstream because it was not ideologically rigorous enough for them. But, you know, most of the bands that, you know, would come later that would sort of embrace sort of Marxist ideals, you know, the press would turn on them too. So, you know, it's the same thing that we're seeing now. It's just this hothouse of narcissism writ large. You know, wounded narcissism really is the term that I use today. And this idea of people who are essentially mediocrities can dictate what other people think and do and believe. And in the case of Rush, they're calling these people Nazis when Geddy Lee is obviously the child of Holocaust survivors, and they're basing their work on Ayn Rand. I mean, I'm not a huge Ayn Rand fan. I'll just say that now. I've never really been a fan of that kind of thinking, but to call that Nazism. I mean, Dave Marsh and Rolling Stone called Queen fascist. It's just unbelievable thinking. It's so insane and so delusional. You really have to wonder where the thinking is coming from.
Yeah, it is. It is ridiculous. I mean, Ayn Rand, I'm a little different. I never thought Atlas Shrugged was any good, but I do feel that Anthem and The Fountainhead are some of my favorite novels when it comes to the fight of the individual against the state. Both novels I love. So it's I appreciate Rand for what she's contributed, and like everybody, it's complex. And actually, there was a question for Bob or maybe Carol. Speaking of, it's Neil was heavy into Rand's philosophy. How, if any way, can Gnosticism and objectivism be harmonized? Can it be harmonized, Bob?
I doubt it. I'd have to think more about it, but it's pretty clear that Neil and the group are an embodiment of the kind of hero in Randian novels, like in The Fountainhead. This guy, the architect, they buy his designs, but then start screwing around with them. So he blows up the building complex because the autonomy and integrity of the artist and his work cannot be compromised because he is one with it. Well, the famous thing about when Rush started to get big and their record company said, why don't you do some more pop oriented stuff and all that? And they said, to hell with that. If they insist on that, we're dissolving the group and going back to working in the auto parts store. That's exactly a Randian notion lived out. The Gnosticism, I don't really see. I don't think they think there is knowable secret information out there. And there are these wisps and hints of some reality beyond, yet it's the kind of thing that cannot be drawn down into our subject object objective world, or it'll be destroyed, it'll be debunked. Captain Kirk always used to say that, in not so many words, that there are a lot of mysteries out there, but they're just problems, and sooner or later we can solve them. Whereas Tillich said that there are great mysteries, but when they are revealed, they're revealed as mysteries. And again, it's the holy, it's the numinous. If it were a thing, but just be Professor Marvel behind the curtain in the Emerald City, it would be debunked. And so I don't see, though I'd be real interested to know what the questioner sees.
Well, what occurs to me, and tell me if I have the term wrong, but it's like Ayn Rand wouldn't want a bunch of Sukhothai in on her committee, right?
Well, yeah. The like those are the Lilliputians that Nietzsche worries about. Let yourself get tied down by the Adam Schiffs of the world.
Oh God.
And so yeah, that's there's a real connection there. And you're right. I mean, the Gnostic was a Superman, and he presumably, well, and despite the bad press they got, as far as we know, they had a bodhisattva-like compassion for the Sukhothai, the ones that the natural men and women. They meant well. They did well. Even they weren't wicked. And God. The unknown God had made a plan B for them. So they didn't despise them, but they wouldn't be tied down and keep the laws of the demiurge, because they knew the Superman, the Gnostic Illuminatus, knows better.
Well said. And that's interesting. You talked about having to do pop music, and that's a question I now have for Chris, because yes, how the times have changed. Rush does Caress of Steel. The record label's like, what are you guys doing? You know, you're too artsy and you need something more pop. And they say, oh, sure,
That
we'll
was
do
an
an F.
awesome album.
Yeah. Rush says F you, and they do an even more artistic,
Mm.
progressive album. Is this something that you notice, Chris, how the times have changed, that even in those days, at least record labels would want to nurture you, work with you, give you 3 albums for you to find your voice and take a risk? And those days are over, Chris, or have been over for a while?
Well, yeah, there's the whole concept of development, that you would sign an artist and you would develop them. You would let them sort of grow, and they were thinking more long term in those days. It's not today where, if you don't have a hit right away, you're just basically thrown down the memory hole. So I think with Rush, I mean, they had a real long runway. I mean, they took them a long time to get, established, certainly in this market. I don't think they cracked the top 40 until Permanent Waves. I mean, they sort of were bubbling under, and they were sort of, a cult act and maybe big in the college areas and so on. But, I mean, like I said, and when I was into them, nobody knew who they were. When 2112 and All the World's a Stage came out, nobody had any idea. And it really took them, all of the 70s really, to get up and running and to get established to the point where they're starting to headline major shows and play, large halls in this area and or in this country at least. So you would not see that today, certainly not. But then again, you wouldn't see a band like Rush get signed in the first place. They would be on, SoundCloud or an indie label at best. It's just not there anymore. And that's the thing that really bothers me about Neil's death, is that we're just losing all the giants. We're losing all the people who really came into the world and made their mark and set an example. It's happening all the time. I mean, every day you see people who all of us certainly grew up admiring, and people who really they moved the ball forward. They moved the culture forward, and now everything's moving the culture backward. And I don't see an end to this. I really don't. I don't want to sound overly pessimistic, but we're not going to see another band like this again unless things drastically change. And to be honest with you, I mean, the entire ecosystem that supported a band like this and would allow a band like this 8 years to really sort of establish themselves is gone entirely. It's just gone. It just doesn't exist anymore.
Well, why doesn't it exist? Because I mean, even in the 80s or 90s, you could, a band like REM, you know what I mean? Bands were given 2 or 3 albums. What changed?
The market changed. Things like downloading, streaming, that changed a lot. I mean, video games. Music just doesn't have the centrality in the culture that it once had. It's not. It's just background noise for most people, or most younger people today. I mean, you do have kids who are really interested in music and really passionate about it, but it's just not like it was in the 60s and 70s and 80s, where that was the culture. I mean, that was youth culture, was music, and that's how young people interacted with each other and communicated with each other. And it doesn't exist anymore. There's just too many options. I think MTV really hurt the culture in a lot of ways because it demystified music.
The same thing. Yeah.
Yeah, it just made it too available. I mean, it used to be, this is like totally get off your lawn kind of talk here, but you didn't get sick of these acts. You didn't see them all the time. They weren't available to you. MTV didn't come around till 81. I mean, Rush had already been pretty much established by then, but they weren't, particularly a very visually, appealing band. I mean, that wasn't really their thing. But the culture just changed because of technology, because of the ubiquity of again, streaming video, YouTube, all these kind of things. It just changed, and other things took precedent. Like I said it before, video games are you know, young men, that's their predominant or primary form of pastime and entertainment these days, which I think is a catastrophe. But you know, what are you going to do?
Yeah, I think I think you're right. It was okay. We could almost all agree that these bands like Rush that were touring, that you were lucky if you saw once a year, or you might catch a friend and tape his music and listen. They were sort of like the mystery religion. What do you think, Bob? Do you think some of these bands were akin to a mystery religion, or Carol?
Yeah, it was a club. It was a way of life. A sort of it was the soundtrack of your life. I don't know. Now it's it's the way I see it. Maybe it's because I'm old now. Is the music is so much more, much more filled with sprinkled with all kinds of vice, you know, um, unashamedly, you know, and that just takes the wonder and you know, just vitality and I don't know, all these great qualities, the mystical sense of really true art. You know, now we just have this stuff churned out. Everyone knows it. I mean, where I live, I observe students and they are just coming up on you know, it's like the middle aisles of the supermarket, you know, all the stuff that's processed and it lacks any life energy. I don't know. It's just and when people are fed on that, the culture really suffers. I'd like to see that turn around. I mean, Rush has influenced countless bands, and many of them are very good. I liked a lot in the '90s. I just went to a Tool concert recently. I think
Oh,
they're
wow.
tremendous.
Very jealous.
And you know, I mean, they're kind of out there, but you know, some people would call it the fake news. But I mean, it's the inaccurate, the unrepresentative. I mean, you know, there. I guess you know. I guess well, there's blogs. You know, there's a lot to wade through if you want to find your tribe. But just walking out the door sometimes. Well, it depends where you live. But you know, it's a game of who's got your attention. Like who has the shiny stuff. What are you attracted to? What are you turning your head for? And unfortunately, a lot of people are dangling just the lowest fruit, and people are satisfied with the uh, sex, drugs, and well, all that stuff can be good. You know, a dark and a bright side to all that stuff. But I mean, it's all for the wrong reasons. And again, I sound old.
Well, sociologists speak of audience cults, fans of Deepak Chopra and other people that they'll or Wayne Dyer and so forth, that they don't have an actual live-in situation like the Moonies or the Krishnas, but they are we still on, by the way?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
The screen just changed. But if they can go to one of these things, they will, and they have a sense of common identity and so on. New Age teachers and all that, like the Hay House Radio and their events, that would be an audience cult. And it a cult band, and that's not unfair. There's nothing insidious about that. It's just that there is this strong sense of identity among real Rush fans. The conventions, especially the performances, I don't know what they're going to do now, But yeah, there's an Elvis cult, and there a few years ago there were a couple of books written asking, is there really an Elvis religion? And the wisest treatment of it I read said, well, yes, but it's not about the sacred, it's about the profane. There are no beliefs involved. And I thought, yeah, that seems right to me, because I've seen the same sort of thing in Lovecraft fandom. I mean, I used to give homilies at the Cthulhu prayer breakfasts, at the Necronomicons. At least this was before I got kicked out for not being politically correct. But in the good old days, I would do stuff like that, and we'd have a Cthulhu choir and stuff. It was all like fun and funny. There were no, to my knowledge, there were no lunatics who actually believed in Cthulhu and all that, but it was great fun to go through the motions. And you got to ask yourself, well, if you're doing religious sort of stuff, why is it not a religion? It's like, I don't know if it was Freud or whoever, but crazy. I think that's the same with the cult or religion aspect. So yeah, it's definitely a cult, but in a completely innocent and positive sense.
Yeah, I don't. You were politically incorrect. You got kicked out just for saying the word jihad, right? Wasn't that what
That
started it
was,
all?
yeah, I said that Lovecraft was prescient or whatever. He forecasted that there would be an invasion of the West by way of immigration from various far reaches of the globe, and these people would bring in a revolt against Western-centric rational thought and precipitate a retreat into superstition as people fled the uncomfortable revelations of science. I said, this is happening, and so forth. And they naturally said, well, you're a racist. And I was then, well, I wasn't told directly, but a friend of mine who was on the planning committee told me that they decided after that I could never speak at the thing again. And it's just, I find it hilarious. The funniest thing about it was, at this very meeting, I got the Robert Bloch Award for lifetime contribution to Lovecraft studies, and then I'm out. It's just so funny. But yeah, I was booted for being politically incorrect.
Yeah, the old cancel culture. In fact, Chris,
Yep.
you've also been writing about too. You were writing about Lovecraft, I think, about a week ago. I think,
Was I?
yeah, you were arguing. You're sort of guarded about the Lovecraft movies coming down, and you're sort of
Oh, yeah,
remember?
yeah.
Nicolas Cage
Colorado
in a
Space.
Lovecraft movie.
Yeah, Colorado Space should be out. I think February 24th or something. Yeah, it's interesting because I think that there's probably a lot of crossover between Rush fans and Lovecraft fans.
Mm-hmm.
I can't help but wonder, because Metallica did the second album was very Lovecraft oriented, and I'm sure they spun a lot of Rush in their day as well. They seem to be, at least in their younger days, sort of the market for that kind of music. It's very much the same kind of mentality, I think, that both of them sprung from. I think they went in very drastically different directions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Rush was certainly a lot more optimistic and positive than certainly Lovecraft was. But it's interesting how these things will bleed into the culture, but they need to be repackaged, I guess, is kind of what I'm seeing. But you see, like, I was watching on YouTube, like, this concert, I believe it was down in Brazil, and there was maybe 300,000 fans there. I mean, just for Rush. So
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
it's interesting how, like, things will sort of cycle through in America and Canada and the UK in many regards. But, you know, we'll move on to other markets. And I know that Rush were phenomenally popular in Latin America and in other cultures. And, you know, that you wouldn't necessarily think would embrace that kind of thinking, because it does seem very Western and rational and sort of a little bit white coaty. But, you know, music is music. And I think, you know, it sounds horribly cliche, but it is a universal language. And you know,
well, just look at Spinal Tap's revival in Japan.
of course, yeah. How
The
can we forget?
classic. The classic, yes. And my friend who was getting deported, I mentioned about Neil Peart, and he like started freaking out. He's from Guadalajara, and he thinks the greatest band in Iron Maiden. There's nothing like them. And I'm like, oh wow, it's great to see that, you know, deep down in Mexico, again, these sci-fi fantasy bands are so popular. So
Yeah.
Mm. Well, I have a CD of a band called Shub Nagurath, and they're Mexican.
Mexican, oh my god, I'm gonna have to hunt those people down.
Yeah, it's pretty neat.
Yeah, very much so. And it should be mentioned too, despite Neil Peart's success, his brilliant mind, and everything they did, I always have to go back to what a hard life he led towards the end. I mean, he lost his daughter to a tragic car wreck, and then his wife died soon after of cancer. Bob and Carol, did he learn any lessons or change his worldview after that?
Well, his worldview, that's a good question. I know that he took to the road right at that time in order to process what had happened. And he discovered, you know, with his full attention on the landscape and the people where he traveled, his perspective kind of changed, further understanding that, you know, the world is a much greater thing than he imagined. I don't know, and somehow taking that in helped him deal with his situation. He was not bitter. I mean, he did not have a God to take it up with. He I don't know, I think probably a very psychologically sound and healthy thing by finding the way he best could deal with it. You know, he was very in touch with himself and how he responds to things. And I think, you know, which is, you know, always been a good lesson, you know, look within, know thyself. I mean, that's the foundation of living a good life, is you must do this first. And he was in the practice of doing that. So he came out of it very well. It would seem. I mean, it's still very painful, but he went on to tour, write. He included writing books on top of writing the lyrics for the songs. You know, his regular practices and well, touring, all that was very strenuous, and you know, and he wasn't getting any younger, yet he put more onto his schedule. Like, again, you know, with his traveling, he would travel between or to all the gigs on a motorcycle, and you know, just interact with the people. And as Bob mentioned, he would always make a point of stopping at museums or whatever that area was famous for. He really took everything in, and he truly lived his life very fully. And, you know, that's probably kind of a good antidote to anything. I mean, antidote.
Mm-hmm.
So.
I wonder how much anybody knows, is in a position to say publicly about how he reacted to, well, we know how he reacted to his severe arthritis when he was in the last stages of touring and all that.
That was the other thing.
And he just soldiered on
Yeah.
because he felt the responsibility to the fans. But when he was the last few months of his life confined to a wheelchair and unable to speak, I would love to know. I'm guessing he took that stoically because he was already realizing, well, things don't last forever, and he could tell he was sort of shutting down, and that's ultimately why they stopped touring and recording. So I'm guessing he just sort of finished it out. He knew it would come to that sooner or later, but I'd love to know, though it's none of my business.
Yeah, I'm sure he had no regrets, really.
Yes, indeed, and that's interesting too, Chris. Towards the end of his life, these rock gods sort of fall apart. I mean, again, this is the days. Remember when bands could put out 1 or 2 albums a year and tour around, and eventually, I think Geddy Lee destroyed his vocal cords, and Neil Peart
Really?
got too old. I mean, it's they do fall apart, and yes, the
Not
record
Keith
com-
Richards.
One
Sterling
Somehow he's
example.
still going. Don't ask me how that guy's still on the road.
He probably made a deal with Mick Jagger. I mean, the devil.
I really believe this is going to sound really corny and stupid, but I really believe that rock and roll has a rejuvenating power. I think you see a lot of artists that stay younger than they should for a long time because of the music and because of
Steven Tyler.
Yeah, I mean Steven Tyler. I mean, I think he's doing a lot of hormone replacement therapy personally, but
No,
well,
maybe
that's another show.
Yeah.
Yeah, he sure put himself through a lot of stuff before that. But yeah, okay.
But I think the music, I mean, it gets you get your blood pumping, it gets you moving, that which is not in use atrophies, right? So I think that, the music can really rejuvenate you, but, it does take its toll eventually because of the rigors of touring and the
performers are putting something else into it. Yeah.
Well, I mean, Eddie
Mick
Van
Jagger
Halen's had it. Yeah, but it does. I mean, just the physical rigors of performing can really damage your body. And touring, I mean, just touring itself, the travel,
sleep patterns, all that. Yeah, it's not. It's
the
not
diet. I mean, just everything.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, it's a mixed bag. I think with Neil, it's probably a lot of it is genetic. I mean, a lot of these kind of diseases, arthritis and brain cancer, can be genetically determined. But of course, hitting things with sticks, for 30 or 40 years is not going to do your ligaments or your joints much good either.
Right.
So I mean,
but the listeners, however,
I think Geddy still looks great. I mean, Geddy looks better than he ever has. I mean, he's not a handsome man, but he's sort of he's got that Jeff Goldblum thing where he's sort of aged into his face. Alex, I think is
exactly yes.
Yeah, I think Alex kind of maybe enjoys a meal or two a bit too much, but
he's still got that boyish face, though.
Yeah, they paid their dues. I mean, they did their job. I mean, they moved the culture forward. And again, it's the thing that it concerns me, and it's horrible to hear like the suffering that somebody like Neil would go through. It's just you wonder where the justice in it is. There is none. But the thing that concerns me is that there's nobody waiting in the wings to be the next, Neil Peart. I mean, it's not going to happen. There's not going to be another Rush again, unless things really change, unless the culture sort of evolves into a new phase. And even then it will be different. But, and it isn't just music. It isn't just rock and roll. I mean, jazz was everywhere for 50 years, and then it wasn't, and rock and roll seems to be going the same way. But at the same point in time, I mean, I think these distinctions are really kind of arbitrary, because most of the pop music and so-called R&B and all these kind of styles that I hear on the top 40 radio today, I mean, it's like that old Billy Joel song, it's still rock and roll to me. It's all the same thing. It's the same chords being played. It's the same 4/4 beats. It's all the same thing. It's just the externals change, the styles change. But having somebody, having a group that's going to put that kind of thought and that kind of care into their art, I don't know. I just don't see it, continuing, and it's very sad. But it isn't just music. I mean, look at how horrible movies are now. I mean, it's just that. I mean, how many people even read for pleasure anymore? There's so many things that are just degrading and just kind of falling apart, and a lot of it does have to do with technology.
Yeah, I would agree. And that's almost ironic because Neil was a proponent of technology making us better. He saw, I don't, so I wonder how he'd feel with these things. Interesting with Geddy Lee, I remember as a teenager, I would always get confused because I would confuse him from the bad guy from the movie The Warriors, the three bottles and Warriors come out. I always thought he looked like him, but neither here nor there. So, we are getting towards the end of the interview. It looks like Bob and Carol had to bail out. They had to go. Oh, it looks like they're coming back. I thought did you guys take your train to Bangkok or what happened there?
Yeah. Boy.
I wish. No, I mean, for other reasons, but
Yeah. We're getting towards the end of the interview. So, Bob or Carol, any last words about what Rush meant to you, or how Neil's music changed you for the audience to say au revoir?
well, I think Neil and his lyrics helped open up vistas for me. I think I probably would not have explored lofty things for the thought if it weren't for my exposure at age 14, 16. So.
Well, it brought me closer to Carol. She wouldn't have gone to Montclair State to major in philosophy if not for them, and that's where I met her. And she introduced me to Rush, which I immediately fell in love with, like I did with her. And we've been big Rush fans. Well, her before, me ever since. I've been, I think, just to 4 Rush concerts, but Carol far outdoes me, having been
a big 7.
8, right?
Oh, something like that. Okay.
Yeah, and she saw Rush at the
Capitol Theater in Passaic. Yeah.
And way back there in '76, and
7.
76.
Just back.
Yeah. But yeah.
Anyway, well, yeah, just we'll always hearing one of their songs unlocks a piece of my history. It's in a real sweet way. I love it.
No, I'm with you. I think I must admit I'm embarrassed. I saw Rush once, but I was so wasted I can't remember, and it's going to haunt me for the rest of my life. And don't do drugs and go to concerts. That's all I'm going to say, because I'll regret it for the rest of my life. So I'm sure part of my consciousness thought it was great, but the one that can remember, the one that stores memory, can't remember a damn thing. So, Chris,
there's always YouTube.
Yes, and YouTube. Yeah, sad life. So, Chris, any last words about Rush? What they meant to you? Did you see him in concert?
No, I never did. Because at that point in time, I was very orthodox punk rock. So by the time,
straight from the religion.
Yeah, that talk about mystery cults. That was a genuine mystery cult in every possible way. But Mithraic, Boston hardcore is very Mithraic. No, but Rush to me kind of just opened up my imagination. I think would be the best way to put it, and again sort of created this liminal space of possibility that you didn't have to adhere to the idioms and to the conventions and to the cliches that had just become so worn out, and you can just sort of create your own sound. I mean, Rush had their influences, but they didn't sound like anybody who came before them. I mean, I don't, certainly not if they got all the Zeppelin out of the system. So it's just a question of like, creating a space where new things can happen, I think, is really what it boils down to for me.
It's hanging up.
Yeah, well said, Chris. Yeah, Rush really, again, really influenced me. It taught me I was an individual. I did belong. Obviously, albums like Signals and so forth was transformative, protective, a coping skill, gave me a sense of perspective to me in the world and me in society, and the struggle of not man versus nature or man versus men, but just man versus the machine. I think that was the great warnings. Even in songs like Free Will, there was parts where like Neil's talking about a host of holy horrors to direct our aimless dance and so forth. Those are the parts I really liked. That was a cat. Those are the parts that I really liked because those were the Gnostic sort of Lovecraft parts. And I was like, Neil, don't start talking about the other part. I like these parts, the Gnostic parts. Oops. Sorry about that. I think the cat just knocked off my camera.
Oh, we have 4 of them swarming around us, ready to do who knows what.
Yeah, I have 2. All right, cat, what did you do to the camera? Oh, well.
I have 8, and they're all locked downstairs. So.
Oh, I know. Well, this one was,
Whoa.
This was under the bed sleeping, so it caught me off guard. I thought I had the room cleared. 8 cats. How do you do with that, Chris?
I don't know. Just, it's an addiction, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
We understand.
Next time we talk to you, we'll probably have 8.
Okay. No. Okay. Let's see. I got my camera rolling. Let's hope the cat doesn't destroy it. Where's the cat? Because I do want to say goodbye to the audience if I can get this going. Okay. Well, looks like the cat. Oh, I think the cat just broke my camera. Oh, cat, that's $99. You silly cat. Well, anyway, for the audience that can hear me, this show, of course, will be available on YouTube. I will have on the show notes information about Chris, about Bob, and the audio version will be on iTunes, iHeartRadio, your favorite podcatcher will be out there. For patrons and members, I do want to include our interview with Chris and his excellent book, The Secret History of Rock and Roll, because it really does relate to a lot of subjects that Bob and Carol and Chris, of course, were talking about. The shift in music and how we've lost these wonderful gods that we're losing. And yes, but I hope we did give Neil the honor that he deserves, and I hope everybody never forgets him. They live as long as we remember. Oh, there's Bob. You've got your cat. Hopefully, won't knock your camera
this one's
off.
Onyx.
Yeah,
Yeah, he's a good boy.
Because mine just ain't working. So for you audience, thank you very much for joining us tonight on this Friday. Bob and Carol, thanks for coming on the show. It was a pleasure and an honor talking about this great figure.
Well, thank you for inviting us.
Yeah, it's a great honor.
Yes, anytime.
Thank you, Ted Knowles, too.
Yes.
Little inside joke there.
Well, Chris, as always, thank you very much for coming on AM Byte. I always appreciate your gnosis and your insights on past, present, and future.
Oh, it's always an honor, believe me.
All right. Well, good night, everybody, and we shall talk to you soon. Hello and goodbye, as always.